Esther the Queen by William M. Taylor. 3. The Orphan Maiden. Esther, Chapter 2. When in their progress westward the kings of Assyria or Babylon had subdued any important city or territory, they adopted the plan of carrying its inhabitants to some of their eastern possessions and supplying their places by colonists sent from other provinces. In this way, certain results, valuable to the conquerors at least, were secured. They filled the conquered place with settlers on whose loyalty they could rely, and thus freed themselves from the necessity of constantly occupying it with a large armed force. They peopled the great cities which they were building in the east with inhabitants, and by removing the captives from their homes and scattering them over a wide area, they broke up the sentiment of nationality among them, so that within 2 or 3 generations they came, for the most part, to be merged in the general population of the empire. While, however, this method of deporting a conquered community from their own land to another is called a captivity, we should err if we were to suppose that the exiles were held in slavery, properly so called. They were, indeed, prevented from returning to their own country, but in every other respect they were treated like the other subjects of the empire. So far as appears in history, no interference with their religious belief or worship was attempted, save on very rare occasions, and posts of honor and emolument were as open to them as they were to others. They were thus encouraged to become identified with the empire, and were, as a rule, treated in such a way as to bind them as firmly as possible to the throne. By such captivities in the year 740 or 741 BC, and again in the year 720 BC, the 10 tribes of Israel were carried away by the kings of Assyria, and so thoroughly were they amalgamated with those among whom they were dispersed, that all efforts to trace out their subsequent history have been thus far in vain. Rather more than a century later, a similar fate befell the tribes of the kingdom of Judah, who were carried away at different times by the rulers of Babylon. 7 such captivities in all have been enumerated by historians, but of these 3 have been considered more important than the others. The first was in 605 BC, when Daniel and his companions were among those removed. The second in 598 or 597 BC, when Jeconiah, otherwise called Jehoiachin, with all the nobles, military officers, and skillful artificers were taken away. And the third in 582 BC, when Zedekiah was led away blind and childless to the metropolis of his conqueror, and Jerusalem was laid waste. Following Jeremiah's advice that they should seek the peace of the land to which they should be carried, the great majority of the captives settled down in their new homes to business pursuits, and some of them rose to the highest offices about the court and in the empire, so that when, in consequence of the edict of Cyrus, Zerubbabel set out with a large number of his countrymen on their return to Jerusalem, a great many more declined to accompany him, and preferred to remain in the places which had now become their homes. No formal condemnation is anywhere in Scripture pronounced upon those who thus stayed behind, but we may infer that, as a rule, but with striking exceptions, such as Daniel and Nehemiah, they were largely indifferent to the restoration of the temple and worship of their fathers. They were neither the most patriotic nor the most spiritual of their people, but still they preserved their distinctiveness, and were as really separate from those among whom they resided as the Jews are today among ourselves. Now it is to one of these, Mordecai by name, that we are introduced in the narrative which lies before us this evening. His great-grandfather Kish, a Benjamite, as we might have concluded from his name, even if the record had not clearly told us, had been carried away 114 or 115 years before the date of our story, along with Jehoiachin, the king of Judah. This is itself an evidence that he belonged to the better portion of the Jews, for only those who might be called the upper classes were taken to Babylon at that time. How it fared with him and his household we have now no means of knowing, but here we come upon his great-grandson, settled in the city of Shushan. What he did there before he obtained the office which required him to sit in the gate of the king, or whether he at this time held that office, we cannot tell. but we infer that he was in comfortable circumstances, and we are warranted also in saying that he had a kindly heart. For we find under his roof an orphan cousin, whom he had adopted as his ward, and whom he had supported and educated from a very tender age. Her father, Abihail, was the son of Shimei and brother of Jair, so he was the uncle of Mordecai. And when he and his wife died, leaving their daughter without any earthly protector, Mordecai, quote, took her for his own daughter, end quote, and, quote, brought her up, end quote. At the date of this chapter, it is probable that he was about 40 years of age, and his maiden cousin about 20. She had grown up into a beautiful woman, answering alike to her Hebrew name, Hadassah, which means myrtle, and her Persian designation, Esther, which means a star. It is delightful to come in such a place, on such a manifestation of kindness as that shown by Mordecai to Esther. He might have shaken her off, on the plea that he could do nothing with a girl, or on the ground that she had no legal claim upon him, or on some manufactured pretext. But instead, he opened his heart and his home for her admission, and we do not doubt that she carried a blessing with her to her guardian's house. If she increased his care, she would also double his happiness, and in his nights of affliction or distress her, quote, starry, end quote, radiance would cheer him with its sparkling lustre, while her budding beauty would be to him a constant joy. But, alas, that very beauty was to bring to an end the idyllic sweetness of this pure and holy home life. For now we must return to Xerxes. After the feast was over, and Vashti had been displaced, and the monarch began to realize what he had done when he had decreed that, quote, she should come no more before him, end quote, he missed his favorite wife, for, as we may well believe from the spirit which she showed when he insulted her with his drunken command, she had been more to him than a mere beautiful toy, and her companionship had been both profitable and delightful. He began to feel that he had been hasty, and possibly there were thoughts of recalling and reinstating her shaping themselves in his mind. But if she returned to her old place, woe betide those who had counselled Xerxes to put her away, for then their time would come, and their destruction would be sure and swift. So, for their own protection, they counselled the king to take steps for putting another into her place. And the advice they gave shows what sort of men they were, and what sort of master they served, as well as what sort of time they lived in. We need not go into the particulars. Suffice it to say that they resulted in the levying of a, quote, maiden tribute, end quote, from all the provinces of the empire for the gratification of the royal lust, and that he might choose from among them a successor to Vashti. Among those taken from their homes to the royal seraglio for that purpose was the beautiful Esther. Some have supposed that this change in Esther's life was brought about by the diplomacy of Mordecai. Others have argued that it was with his consent, and some have even gone so far in absurdity as to affirm that Mordecai, in procuring the admission of Esther into the harem, was acting under special divine guidance. But all these opinions are wide of the mark. The real, but terribly sad truth was that when the officers, appointed to gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan the palace, saw Esther, they took possession of her, without asking either her consent or Mordecai's, in the king's name, and carried her away, just as they would have done with any chattel that was required for the payment of a tax. The autocratic theory was that all subjects belonged to the king, to be used at his pleasure, and this was only one particular instance under that general law. It would have made no matter, therefore, whether either Mordecai or Esther protested or not, for the king was absolute, and his will was law. We do not know, however, that they did protest or resist, and it may have been that they had become themselves so demoralized by the impure moral atmosphere of the place in which they lived as to count that an honor which Scripture teaches us to regard as the foulest dishonor. And it is when we come into contact with narratives like this that we are most fully reminded of what Christ has done for the defense and protection of the female sex. Still, it does not become even us to be Pharisaic on this matter. We may not forget the astounding and horrible revelations made recently in London, which caused a shudder all over England and the Christian world. Nor may we shut our eyes to the existence among ourselves of that which has been emphatically called, quote, the great sin of our great cities, end quote. In some respects, the state of things in Shushan was better even than it is in our modern Babylons, for those who had been thus dishonoured by the monarch were supported all through their afterlives by him as secondary wives, while, alas, the victims of the seducers of these days are cast aside after a time, to sink down and down and down until they become street waifs, with scarce a remnant of womanhood left in them, and such that, quote, the veriest wretch that goes shivering by will make a wide sweep lest they wander too nigh, end quote. While few care for them in any respect, and least of all those to whom first they owed their degradation. We talk of Mormonism and its polygamy, and we cannot say anything too strong against that abomination, whose rise and progress is the shame of our 19th century. But it were easier to deal with that if there were not this kindred wickedness in our own city life. And I earnestly lift up my voice in warning against the danger which all this bodes to our national existence. These evils are no better than those which we find here in Persia long ago. But with us they exist in spite of Christianity, and are emphatically condemned by it, while with them they were the legitimate results of the religion which they professed, and that makes all the difference. Let us therefore bring our Christianity to bear in this direction, for that alone will meet the case. Young men, I beseech you to set your faces as a flint against all such things, and let all those who are secretly indulging in iniquity of this sort remember that God will one day bring them into judgment with him. It is a serious thing to poison the wellhead of family life, and the frescoes of Pompeii explain all too well the downfall of the Roman Empire. For your own sakes, therefore, for the sake of the nation, and for the sake of Christ, keep yourselves pure, and beware of becoming in any way partaker of other men's sins, by allowing their wealth or position or respectability in society to condone for you the infamy of their sensuality. We turn with loathing from a murderer, why not from an adulterer? For the one is as really a breaker of the Decalogue as the other. It is not agreeable to have to say these things, but it is needful to say them, and I dare not keep silence. On Esther's entrance into the harem, she found a friend in Hegai, the keeper of the maidens, and as the result of this abominable competition, she was ultimately exalted to the place of Vashti. A great feast was given in her honor, but probably, because of his former experiences, Xerxes was more prudent on this occasion, for we do not read of any such excesses as those which issued in the idiotic order which Vashti refused to obey. But it is not safe for an Eastern monarch to disgrace one who has been at the head of his harem. And just after the account of his exaltation of Esther, we read of a plot which was made by two of his chamberlains against the life of Xerxes, and which it is probable had been concocted in the interest of Vashti. Be that, however, as it may, the existence of such a conspiracy was somehow detected by Mordecai, whom now for the first time we find, quote, sitting in the king's gate, end quote, an expression which simply implies, see chapter 3 verse 2, that he was one of the king's servants, and by him it was communicated to Esther, who in turn told it to the monarch. The matter was considered of such importance that a special entry regarding it was made in the chronicles of the king's reign, and to Mordecai was given therein the credit of having been instrumental in saving the life of the emperor. It is a curious insight which we thus get into the court life of an Oriental despot, and there is little or nothing about it that is attractive in our eyes. Only two things stand out in this chapter to redeem it from unmitigated vileness. These are the love of Mordecai for Esther and the reverence of Esther for Mordecai. How touching is it to read these words, verse 11, quote, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did, and what should become of her, end quote. I think I see him pacing to and fro in the front of the prison, wherein she was virtually entombed, trying to find some means of communication with her, and overjoyed if he could but catch one glimpse of her loveliness. Quote, every day, end quote, he came thus to satisfy himself, if possible, of her welfare, for his heart was hungry for tidings of her condition, and his home was empty of its former gladness. It is a beautiful picture, all the more affecting because of the background of selfishness and sin out of which it stands here in such distinct relief. And we have the companion to it in verse 20, quote, Esther had not showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him." End quote. It was a reproach then, as unhappily in some quarters it still is, to belong to the Jewish nation, and Mordecai was anxious that Esther should stand simply on her own merits, and should not be handicapped by her lineage, or hindered thereby from rising to the position which otherwise she might obtain. Nor was there any deceit in his advice, for, as Matthew Henry says, quote, "All truths are not to be spoken at all times, though an untruth is not to be spoken at any time." End quote. But with Esther it was sufficient that Mordecai had laid his commands upon her to that effect, quote, "For she did his commandment, like as when she was brought up with him." End quote. So the two were almost as father and daughter, and Esther, far from looking upon her new position as one of emancipation from the old obligation, continued to regard her benefactor with the deepest reverence, for she was sure that everything which he recommended was dictated by the purest affection for herself. These particulars were equally honourable to both, and they are touches of nature which, without any expository help, find their way directly to the heart of every reader of the narrative. But now, before proceeding to the practical part of the discourse, let us look for a few minutes at the chronology of the chapter. The, quote, levy, end quote, on the young women of the empire was made, as seems most natural, shortly after the putting away of Vashti. But in the 16th verse we read that, quote, Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into the house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, end quote. Now, the feast of the former chapter was held in the 3rd year of the monarch's reign, so that there are 4 years to be accounted for, and there would be considerable difficulty in filling up that gap in a satisfactory manner if we were to adopt the view formerly current that Ahasuerus is another name for Artaxerxes Longimanus. But if we identify him with Xerxes, everything is plain, for during these years he was absent on his disastrous expedition against Greece. In his 4th year, as we know from other sources, Xerxes went on to Sardis, and in the spring of that which followed he set forward towards Europe. In the summer of that same year the battle of Thermopylae was fought, and in the autumn his fleet was defeated at Salamis. Then, in the year after that, came the battles of Plataea and Mycale. Then he returned to Sardis, whence, after a sojourn of some little time, he went to Susa. Thus the whole interval is accounted for. But in verse 19 we come upon another note of time, which is more perplexing. For the date of the conspiracy against the life of Xerxes is there given thus, quote, when the virgins were gathered together the 2nd time, end quote. The reference is not very clear, but it is probably an event which was generally well known to both Jews and Persians at the time, and it seems to imply that even after the exaltation of Esther to the place of Vashti, there was another levy made upon the maidens in the homes of the empire, similar to that which swept the orphan Jewess into the royal harem. It is too horrible to think of, but that also is verified by secular history, for Herodotus tells us that Xerxes sought solace for his terrible defeat in giving himself up to the grossest licentiousness. Ah, cruel lust! Would that this had been the last levy made by the remorseless tyranny on homes of happiness and peace. Leaving now these repulsive matters, let us pause for a little and gather up some practical lessons from the whole subject. And, in the first place, we have, in the conduct of Mordecai towards Esther, a beautiful example of thoughtful kindness. He was moved by the forlorn condition of the lonely orphan and took her to his home, supplying her wants, giving her a suitable education, and training her in habits of obedience and piety. No doubt she was his cousin, but not every cousin would have done as he did, and therefore we cannot withhold from him our admiration. But how many Esthers there are in the world for whom there are no Mordecais? Orphanhood is a terrible privation, and there is no appeal so powerful as that which comes from a fatherless and motherless child. Do we know any such that are needing help? And can we give them the help they need? If so, let the example of Mordecai stimulate us to do something for their support. We have orphan asylums, indeed, but these are not nearly sufficient to meet the cases which exist. and there is always room for individual effort. Besides, such personal beneficence is far better for those who engage in it than a mere subscription to an orphanage would be, and very frequently we come upon cases where those who are themselves little removed from the straits of poverty have been instrumental in doing a large amount of good. Not long ago, there came into my hands the life of the Reverend Dr. David King, whose eloquence as a preacher was thrilling multitudes Sabbath after Sabbath in the Greyfriars Church when I was a student at the University of Glasgow, and I found this paragraph among the records of his pastoral experiences, an instance of energetic self-reliance that came under his notice, which he used very graphically to recount. Quote, "A poor cab driver had died, leaving a widow, elderly, childless, and unprovided for. At his first visit he found her in great affliction and anxiety, which he strove to relieve by temporary help and encouraging words. Calling again soon after to see how she was getting on, and in what way he could best be useful to her, he was surprised, on reaching the door of her attic, to be met by a fragrant odour of cookery, and to be received by her with a bright smile as she stirred a steaming pot upon the fire. 'I'm just making dinner for my lads,' she said, and he had scarcely time to ask an explanation before a sound was heard of hurrying feet and merry voices on the common stair, and in rushed a troop of boys, barefoot some of them, and rather ragged, but all perfectly clean, with happy faces, and sure of a welcome. He watched with interest and wonder while they dispatched their savoury meal, and hastened off to their work again. When they were gone, he inquired the meaning of it all. 'Well, sir,' she said, 'after you were here I was gone about thinking what I could do, and I saw a poor laddie standing at the corner of the street, and, thinks I, he wants a mither and I want a son. What for shouldna we come together? And there's money mair in the same case. Why shouldna be a mother to as many of them as me bit rooms'll hold?' She carried out her idea, gathering in from the street some half-dozen homeless boys, making it a condition that they should work and bring all their earnings to her to use for the common weal. With clean faces and with tattered garments mended, she took them one by one the round of her acquaintance in search of honest employment, which she was very fortunate in obtaining. Her plan was to keep a strict account of the money they brought in, and at the end of the week, if any surplus remained after all the expenses of her thrifty housekeeping had been defrayed, to allot it to the different boys in proportion to their earnings, and lay it by for their future benefit, thus wisely encouraging them in habits of industry and forethought. So these poor waifs found a happy home, and the forlorn widow a career of blessed usefulness." End quote. That is a wonderful illustration of what can be done even by the poorest, and I bring it out in this connection that we may all be stimulated by it to do our utmost in the service of our generation by the will of God. The deep poverty of that destitute widow abounded to the riches of her liberality, and like the woman of Zarephath, in sharing her handful with others, she found the old word made good, quote, "The handful of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail." End quote. He who giveth thus to the orphaned and the homeless lendeth to the Lord, who makes both swift and sure repayment with added interest of blessing. But in the second place, we have here forced upon us the contrast between the palace of a heathen emperor and the cottage of a Christian peasant. What a hotbed of intrigue, passion, selfishness, and iniquity this Persian court was. All the splendour of its architecture and all the magnificence of its furniture cannot hide the lasciviousness of which this place was the scene, and yet this was the best the world could afford. Truly we may say, quote, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity and vexation of spirit." End quote. There was no true happiness in it all. But now put over against this chapter such a home scene as that which the Scottish poet has depicted in his, quote, "Cotter's Saturday Night," end quote, and tell me if its simple, rustic, cheerful piety does not dazzle into dimness the, quote, "mocking shine," end quote, of Shushan's gilded vice. And what principally and especially made the difference between them? What but that same, quote, "big ha Bible," end quote, which lies open on the cotter's knee? Yet it is this Christian home life, with all its happiness and all its holy educational influences, that is in danger among us at this day. For the marriage union is the fountain of domestic purity, and few things are more sad in the condition of society among us than the easy frivolousness with which that sacred tie is broken by those who vow to be true to one another, quote, until death should part, end quote, them. But what is lightly made is lightly held, and if more thought and prayer were given to the selection of a partner for life, there would be less temptation to divorce. Quote, "Ah, me," end quote, says Tholuck, quote, "if our youth would but more deeply ponder what it is to choose a partner to be of one spirit and one flesh with them, for the whole of their pilgrimage on earth, their choice would not be made in the false glare of a theatre or a ballroom. Till death shall you part would ring perpetually in their souls. In the light of day they would choose, and by the light of God's word they would try their partner, seek the advice of Christian friends, and not join hands until they were sure of the divine Amen," end quote. These are the marriages which God will bless, and on which happy homes are built, and it is on the households of the people that the nation rests.